Hi, everyone. I'm Ariana Martinez, and I am here to give you a little talk and practice about sound design, which is what I am passionate about in the audio world. Today's session is sponsored by Podspike, and you can find more information about their service in the description underneath the video below. And I just want to thank Sarah for inviting me and to thank all of you who are here. It means a lot to me to know there's so many people interested in the kind of artful, unpredictable side of audio work. And I'm excited to share with you some thoughts and strategies about sound design that come from my own background as a working fine artist, and how you can kind of make the process of working with sound feel material, tactile, creative, and intuitive. So the way this is going to go is that I have a bit of a slide presentation that I'll kind of jump in and out of. So you'll sometimes see my face, you'll sometimes see images on the screen, and then but the majority of our time together will be spent looking at some sessions from some complex projects. So I have two examples from previous projects, one completed in Reaper, which is a lower cost but very powerful program that I think is actually the best suited for sound design, and I encourage all of you to learn. And then the other is in Pro Tools, which at least in the US is the industry standard for most high-level audio production work. And so I'm showing that because it's maybe a program that many of you may be asked to work in or are required to work in for either education or employment purposes. So I'll show the ways that I use both of those creatively to build complex scenes, to manipulate ambient tape, music, dialogue, and that's what it's going to be today. So enjoy. Okay, I'm going to move over to the slide presentation now, so you'll see a visual pop up on the screen. Okay, what you should be seeing is a pale pink textured background with some wobbly pencil scribble shapes and white text that says welcome. My contact information is below. So you'll see my email and website information and my little Twitter handle. Feel free to say hi. I love meeting new audio friends. And just a little bit about me. I think this is helpful context to give because I think a lot of people often have questions about how you get into sound design and into the audio industry in general. And I would say for me, it was a very roundabout path. So I studied in undergraduate, my undergraduate university years, I studied sculpture, practicing fine arts, like learning like those technical skills. And then I also have an academic degree in urban studies, which is, at least for me, was a lot of architectural history, learning about the about cultural and social movements in urban settings, thinking a lot about how people move through the built environment. And then I learned audio technical skills mostly from other people also learning audio. So we were kind of peer-to-peer learning, either, in like after school, like after class university clubs, or I would go up to a neighboring city and take a workshop at, an art center that was offering audio skill building workshops. I learned a lot from other like more established audio makers who were kind enough to offer their time to me in kind of one-on-one way and teach me things. So I didn't, but like audio technical skill building was not part of my formal education. Neither was, the kind of structural narrative aspect of making podcasts and radio. That was also not part of my formal education. That's something that I picked up along the way. And then I kind of, when I left school, when I graduated university, I ended up working, just a nonprofit arts job. I was doing administration, basically filling out paperwork. in the daytime, and then at night and on the weekends, I was making sound art and little radio pieces, putting out a few pitches here and there, but mostly building a portfolio of work that had like my strong creative voice, like before I started to work for any clients. And I think that made a difference in terms of why my work now sounds the way it does, is because I never had like a big institution like, National Public Radio or Gimlet or Spotify or whatever tell me how to make work when I was first starting out. Now I do like big client projects in audio. I still work freelance as a sound designer and occasionally as a story editor on long form narrative shows and documentary. I also work as a freelance illustrator and animator. I work as a media and arts educator, and I have an arts practice, still making my own fine artwork. So today we're going to discuss, the way I've broken this down is to kind of give you some theory. I've tried to shorten that a little bit. I can get really into this stuff, and I have done on other occasions, but I think most of you are here to get into the nitty gritty practical stuff. So but I do think these underlying principles are important to the way that I use sound. So we're going to talk about what I think sound is for in narrative audio projects and how sound can shape a story. And to me, that's mostly about space, time, sensation, like physical sensations, like, and emotion. And then we'll talk about the skills that I think are important to hone if you are trying to be a sound designer or you're trying to do this work on your own projects or make this the primary, avenue of your audio career. And so we'll talk about cultivating sensitivity to your environment. How do you listen to the world to figure out what you want the work you're making to sound like? How do you dissect and annotate narrative to with the intention of sound designing it? So often in my job, I'm given a rough cut, so like an assembled session of just dialogue tape, so interview and narration from the producers. There's no sound in it at all. And I have a very like concrete system of how I listen to work like that and how I make notes for myself about how I'm going to treat it with sound. So basically I give myself a blueprint to work from. And then we'll talk about using your digital audio workstation or DAW. So that's your program like Reaper or Pro Tools, Hindenburg, Audition, whatever you're using, as an artist studio to set it up for maximum flexibility and to make creative use of built-in tools. I think this is very important to not get too in the weeds about, oh, which plugins do I download? And, should I be adding this or that to my setup? Or, what's the best program to use? I don't think any of those are actually good or important questions. I think it was this, you can sound design in anything. Like I've built audio projects on little programs on an iPad before, there are limitations to what you can do, but I think all of these programs have built-in tools that are more than enough to get you where you need to go. Okay, so why is sound important? What does sound do for stories? I think what sound gives us is this other additional language, this almost like parallel track or like stream of water that like runs underneath the kind of more solid, legible parts of narrative, which are spoken dialogue, right? So you have your spoken words that are giving us literal, concrete information. But then with sound, you have this other language that can reach listeners at the gut level, that can get inside their minds and hearts into places that resist language, that are hard to put into words, emotions that are hard to put into words, sensations, experiences that may not have a way to describe them. And we can also, test the boundaries of what what explanation does. Like, does everything need to be explained concretely or literally, or can there be deliberately parts of our stories that are more ambiguous, up to interpretation, or invite multiple meanings? The other thing I think sound allows us to do is to be specific, to inject our own subjective experiences as people living in the world as artists, as people who are making things, into this work, to or to, you know, bring the experiences of the people, maybe the interviewees who have spoken with us, or other people who've contributed to the story, to bring elements of their lived experience and their inner worlds, their emotions, into the story in ways that maybe wouldn't be allowed to be said literally, verbally, in words. I think that sound is an incredibly powerful tool, and it's powerful specifically because it goes sometimes unnoticed. It's something that can run under the surface of a story, but that you can fill with meaning, and that if the right person is listening, they will recognize themselves in that sound, and in that environment that you've built. You know, even if it's a story that may not have allowed for certain things to be said out loud. And I think this is also important for those of us who are working in client based or professional environments, where there may be very strict kind of in-house style guidelines about what we can and can't do. I think sound allows us to make the most of that very tight container, to fill it with meaning, even when there are really tight restrictions placed on us. So how do we get sound to do this? How do we get sound to transform a story in the ways that I think are possible, and to hold so much power? So I think that in most narrative type work, and specifically, I would say, you know, your short form feature, something you might hear on, you know, like BBC4, BBC3, or your long form narrative series, something you might, you know, something that explores a question or a topic in depth and goes, you know, over several episodes. I think those two forms specifically rely on two ways that sound becomes space. And one of those functions is sound is used to build worlds. Sound is used to create distinct and detailed scenes. It is used to place listeners in somewhere specific, like whether that's literally a geographic location, like you almost, you know, when you record field tape, that's almost like giving your listeners a set of GPS coordinates, right? It's you're collecting information that kind of gets your listener as close as possible to the site of your story. And when you build up that environment in sound, when you really layer it with many kinds of texture, movement, you know, sounds that come from near and far, that you make this space feel full, that is, you know, for a moment, you're building a tiny, like, replica world for your listener to sit in. And you're supplying substitutes for other sensory information. So things that your listener might be, you know, otherwise, you know, if they were actually in a place, be able to touch or to see or to smell or to taste. I think that's really, really a really important function of sound, and I'll get more to that later in the presentation as well. The other function, spatial function of sound, I think, is using sound to navigate terrain. So to guide listeners' emotions and attention through your story. Because, you know, when we learn story structure, narrative structure, you know, we're taught different ways of embedding moments of climax or heightened activity, or twists and turns, or cliffhangers and mysteries into our stories. We're taught in an almost formulaic way, actually, how to make listeners pay attention and to stay with us. And I think that, especially in types of work that maybe tests those formats, or presents alternate story formats we might not have heard before, sound can be a way to kind of tether the listener to the story, to make sure that they're with us the whole way, even when we take some maybe divergent paths away from a traditional story structure. It helps listeners navigate transitions. So whether that's transitions between places, like these distinct scenes that I was talking about, or transitions between topics or ideas, or transitions between speakers. I often use sound to help differentiate one speaker's voice from another, especially if we might be going back and forth between people at different points in the story, and I don't want you to forget who we've heard from before. and in general, just helps sustain engagement and keeps listeners really embedded in the world of your story. So back when I was talking about building worlds, I talked about this idea of replicating kind of sensory experiences in audio. And I would say that this is, I think, if I had to pick one thing that I think differentiates the way that I use sound from the way that I hear sound often used in podcasts and radio, is that I am, my sources of inspiration are very experiential. They're things that I felt in the world in a very deep way, and that I kind of hold in my mind as these like crystallized moments that I'm trying to rebuild in sound. So, you know, the gradient of color on a particularly amazing sunset, but also the way it reflects off of a puddle in the street, and also the way it distorts the trees in that puddle's reflection. Like all of those things, the color, the reflection, the distortion, those are things I can do in sound. You know, the particular contrast of savory and sweet when you put balsamic vinegar on a strawberry, right? That sharp acid and then that lingering sweetness, that contrast is something I can make in sound. The tangle of brush and weeds in a vacant lot, and then the like luminous, amazing surprise of poppies, you know, just bursting forth from all of that tangled growth. You know, I can build like chaos and moments of clarity in sound. The movement of a shadow across a sidewalk, you know, these very, very slow shifts in time that if I were to stand there all day, I would see that shadow move and I would see it change shape. I can do the same thing in sound. I can build slow transitions that over the course of my entire story are incrementally changing in these tiny ways. The, you know, grounding, comforting texture of a precious object in your hand. I can make sound, I can make moments of sound that feel precious, that feel held by, just a few moments of space or silence around them. So, you know, it's kind of hard to explain, but I hope that this sort of starts to make sense, that everything that you're experiencing in your world, if you start to pay attention to it and kind of start to log it in your body and in your mind, these are the things you can pull on and pull from to make your worlds and sound feel rich and full and real. And those same skills that we use to build, you know, replicas of real spaces and sound, like I was talking about, we can even expand and extend that skill set to figure out how we can build inner worlds, imaginary worlds, emotional worlds, memories, dreams. It can, and that's like what's so powerful about art making, is that we not only can we like make work directly from observation, we can extend our observations and transform them into things that have yet to be seen. We can access these places that are beyond language, these emotional places like I was talking about. We can make sounds physical qualities, its volume and texture and pitch and its reverberation, its delay. We can make it behave like tension or like heat or like fear or like thirst or obsession or anxiety or hunger. And so just to review, sound has the potential to make us very vividly evoke place and create space in our stories. It gives us the ability to translate sensation, you know, to bring the elements of taste, sight, touch, smell, balance, sensations of heat and cold into our stories. Has the ability to manipulate time. We can use sound to help us move faster or slower, to help us loop back on ourselves in a story. And we can use sound to help invite emotion. and to elicit emotion, even if the literal words of our story aren't doing that. Okay, so what happens when I'm working on a team, on a client project, and I am given that rough cut? I'm given just that session, or sometimes I'm even just given a script, which I find very difficult. If I can't hear tape, I really do need to hear the tape. I need to hear people's voices. I need to hear the emotion, and the tone of voice. That's very important to me. So working from a script is almost impossible. So I always ask for a session, even if it's rough. Um, I'm given a session that has interview tape and narration only. I have a very specific way that I will listen to that session before starting to sound design. So when I first receive it, I will listen to it once, usually with my eyes closed, or sometimes I'll like doodle, like the way you might doodle while you're on a phone call or something, just to keep like myself from even looking at the session or looking at the waveforms. I don't want to be distracted by like what's technically going on. I just want to hear the story. And so I'll listen like that once, and then I'll listen again. And that second listen is when I make notes. And I'll show you how I make notes. I make notes in my sessions in the tape. I don't make notes in a script personally, because I just have trouble. I have difficulty processing large volumes of text, so I can't really work in a script for very long. So making these notes visually in the tape makes more sense for me, but you can do it however you like. But the way that I look at or what things that I'm listening for are, first, major moments and transitions. So obvious things, your opening, your closing, and maybe the story is like midpoint or climax, especially if you're working on a longer program that you know may have an ad break or some other kind of cliffhanger that is going to be built into the story. Those things I immediately mark, because almost always those things, especially on a big client project that has a certain demand for consistency, they're going to want a consistent opening and a consistent ending with end credits. So that's usually a moment where music is doing most of the heavy lifting, not as much ambient tape. And then during that, like, midpoint or transition, that's also a moment where you might have more of a musical transition rather than a scenic transition. So after I've marked that, then I'm looking for those distinct scenes, those moments where, oh, I want to build a little magical real world. I want to create this place or this experience really vividly. And so I'll mark those moments. And the things in someone's interview tape or narration that might indicate to me that I'm going to need to build a scene are anything that references something that you would witness with your senses. So if the speaker is describing something that they are seeing, touching, smelling, etc., anything like that, I mark. Anything that has to do with like atmospheric conditions, so light, temperature, time of day, weather, anything like that, is going to be important, because that's like, those are really actually quite easy sounds to gather and easy things to replicate or to build, even in a non-literal way. You don't have to use rain for rain, but if it's, if day is turning to night, there are ways to change the music to go down in pitch or do something else to start to manipulate the environment that dialogue is sitting in to indicate that shift from day to night. And then I'm looking for prepositions. So any words or even like if you can hear in the tape, someone is walking across a field. So you hear like, the movement of that person from left to right, for example. Anything that indicates distance. So I'm hearing like some other distant, like ambient sound, like maybe this conversation is happening near a railway and I can distantly hear the train. Anything like that, I'll mark, because that gives me more information about where we are, what's going on, how, like, where my speakers are in space. And I think that's harder nowadays because a lot of the tape we're receiving as producers is coming from, remote Zoom interviews, and there's not a lot of tape. But oftentimes, even when people are describing things that they have imagined or remembered, they'll note things like this. They'll use descriptive language like that. And you can still build scenes from that, even if you don't have real field tape. And then I'm looking for like more subtle or minor transitions. So this is when like this listening to someone's voice is really important. I feel like I've become like hypersensitive to people's tone of voice. And, you know, when you start to hear that little wobble or that little crack in someone's voice when they're talking about something emotional, but trying to keep themselves composed, like that's something I'll mark. Or when someone takes a particularly long breath or sigh, I'll note that. Things that indicate to me that that something is happening, a change is happening internally in the speaker that I might want to represent in sound. And then any existing archival that has been already gathered and placed by the producers. So sometimes in projects, producers will already insert something like a news clip or a piece of audio from old children's television program or whatever it is. And these moments can be really difficult to sound design around because they often have completely different textural qualities than your interview tape. Like they're grainy, they're distorted, like there's, you know, or if it's like even recent present day field tape that has been gathered and placed, it still has very different qualities than something that would be captured in a studio. So I know that those moments are going to be areas where I may have to figure out some creative way to lead us seamlessly in and out of those moments of archival tape or field tape. So I'll mark those moments. And then any like literal geographic place identifiers. So if the person speaking says, oh, I'm in Cornwall, or oh, I'm in Seoul, or oh, I'm in Atlanta, you know, like I mark that because that sometimes will mean that I need to go out of my way to get field tape from a place. I may need to get a field recordist or a tape syncer to go get something that I don't already have. From that specific place if I want to build a really accurate scene, especially if it's like journalistically, ethically important to do so. And so when I am making my notes, I'll show you how I do this in the tape. You'll see in a few more slides, but I make all of my notes using markers in my sessions. But oftentimes I will still have to share that information with colleagues, with other producers, maybe sometimes another engineer or someone else on the project who just wants to know what choices I'm making and maybe sign off on certain things or question certain things. So if I'm working collaboratively, I'll often translate my notes about sound into like a spreadsheet format or a table of some kind. And so this is really useful for sharing with colleagues. What I'll do is I'll give a timestamp, so the area where I'm thinking of placing the sound, a note or description of what's happening in that moment in time, and then my to-do list for myself. So I need to build, so in this instance, this is an example from one of the first long form series I worked on called Brain on Nature, which is like a show about a woman recovering from a traumatic brain injury. So there's a lot of scenes in hospitals. It was like, sometimes those are spaces that are kind of sensitive. You don't want to record in a hospital. So we ended up having to build those scenes kind of in this like weird manufactured way from like some field tape taken on the scene and some things that I brought in elsewhere. So in this moment, we're describing a rainy day hospital scene. It's crowded. There's a noisy waiting room. There's a blaring TV. This is all according to the dialogue that's being spoken. Like the narration is saying, this is what's happening. There's rain coming down on the windows and the speaker's feeling anxiety and irritation. I always, if there's emotions in there, I always note them because that will tell me how I'm going to use my sound. It would sound very different if this was like, oh, I'm feeling, you know, optimistic about how this procedure is going to go. Is very different mood than I'm feeling anxious and irritated. And then my to-do list is I need to build the waiting room from the producer's existing field recording. So in this instance, I did have tape from the area around that hospital. I may need to source the TV. So the TV in the field producer's recordings was kind of distant. You couldn't really hear it, but in the narration, the narrator is saying, this TV was blaring. It was so annoying. Oh my God, it was just the most irritating thing. It just like kept yelling at me. And so in order for me to get that across, I may need to bring in a new TV sound that I can manipulate, make louder, make closer to us. I may need to bring in rain, and I may need to bring in some sort of sound that's going to indicate this emotion that is happening in this scene, this anxiety and irritation. And in this instance, I chose like a subtle electrical hum. And so this just helped my co-producer understand like what I was doing, why I was making certain choices. And I think this is especially helpful if you're working on an ambitious sound design project and you may have to defend why you're, going so far. Like, why are you taking it to this level? Like, why are you choosing to really amplify this scene? And then this is another example of, this is more of like a pre-plan or like a kind of reflection of after a project was completed and I got a lot of questions about how something was made. This was a program, an hour-long program that I did with my collaborator, Jackson Roach, about the experience, like unusual experiences of sensory perception. So all of us have different ways our bodies process the external world. And this was like an educational, but also kind of sentimental program about that. And we had these instances where we were trying to describe like things that are really difficult to capture in sound, the sensation of balance or equilibrium, sensation of temperature. These things are really difficult to capture in sound. And this is a session I'm going to share with you in just a moment. So I won't go too much into this, but you'll hear in one of the earlier sections of the program, we're trying to describe the sensation of going around a curve on your bike. So that moment where, you do have to kind of shift your body weight enough to get the bicycle to go around that curve. And you might fall, you might not make it. It might be a tight turn, but you do, and you come out of that smoothly. Like that kind of elation and relief that comes from that, from regaining your balance. We figured that we couldn't really capture that. Like I couldn't run alongside Jackson riding their bike and capture that on tape. So we needed to figure out something else, some other object that we could get to go around a curve. And what that ended up being was a pencil slowly drawing circles on a rough sheet of paper. So we actually zoomed really, really far into something super small to make a sound that's actually quite a big movement. And we ended up manipulating a little bit. We pitched it down, we panned it back and forth, we used some reverb. We kind of manipulated that sound to make it feel bigger than it was and to get at this sensation of balance and equilibrium. So this is just a slide about music and archival permissions. I'm not going to go into this because I think that it's information you can find elsewhere. But TLDR, my strategy is I only use things that are marked Creative Commons 0 or things that I've gotten directly from a composer that I'm working with. I don't bother to try and license things just because I am only me and I don't have a budget for that. So I have a budget to pay a composer. If I really love them and care about them and want to collaborate with them, I will make room for that. But most of the time I'm working with something like Freesound or Internet Archive and selecting only for things that are Creative Commons 0. And this is some search terms that I use, ways of navigating those sites because they're quite big archives. Keep your search terms simple, always select Creative Commons 0, and that'll narrow your results to royalty-free usable files. Use additional tags to further narrow your search and get at specific types of sound, and specify your file type if you're using a program like Pro Tools that will reject things like a FLAC file. Okay, so what you all probably been waiting for is actually for me to actually show you something real and not just talk about theories. So we're gonna, I'm gonna skip a couple of things. I'm conscious of time. And we might come back to these things, but essentially what I'm going to show you are two sessions. I'm going to show you one in Reaper, which is Feeling With, which is that program about sensory perception. And it's a very long and complex project. It was an hour long. It was composed of 5 parts. Each of them was a really complex scene. Each of them also had original music that was composed from like found sounds and basically like weird Foley that Jackson did like in their apartment with found objects. It's created in a pretty chaotic way. But I'm showing it to you because I think it's a good example of why Reaper is good and flexible for sound designers, and how I specifically use it to make it feel more manageable to do a complex project. The other thing I'm going to show you is a session. So this is an example. You're going to see this up close, but you're going to see how I organize and color code tape based off of spatial transitions, like where we are in space, where we are in the story. You're going to see how I use markers to indicate notes to myself. You're going to see how I navigate my clips list or my files, and how I can test files out before actually placing them in the session. You'll see, again, these organizational ways of breaking up your session to make it easy to navigate. And then I'll also show you a session in Pro Tools, which was from a client project. And the reason I'm showing you this is because often this will be the industry standard. This will be what you're asked to work in. But I do think that Pro Tools has some limitations that don't make it great for sound designers in particular. And part of that is about organization and how customizable it is. It's not, you kind of locked into what Pro Tools is arranged to be. But there's a scene that will show you specifically how I built a kind of musical sequence. As someone who is not a composer, I built a kind of musical sequence to do something very specific related to like giving the 4 points of view, the voices that were interviewed for a project, their own distinct kind of sonic ID and marker. Like, how do you introduce 4 different voices within the span of, I think it was like 3 or 4 minutes? I needed to get us to know who these people are, understand why they're important, and to understand them also as like part of a collective story. And I did that with sound. So we're gonna go into Reaper first. And then I'm going to, well, actually, we'll go into Reaper first. Hopefully everything plays successfully. If you can't hear some things, I'm sure Sarah will let me know in the chat. But first I'll just show you, I'll show you what this is first, and then I'll go into the session. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at is this project here, Feeling With. This project is about how we perceive the world, and how sometimes those of us who have particular sensitivities that might be, kind of on the far ends of that bell curve, might experience things in more extreme ways than others. And so you can see that it's broken into these 5 parts that all have like very specific visual, tactile, other sensory inspiration that we were able to like actually capture in the web version of the project, which was cool. But you'll see in my session, which I'm going to show you now, it's also broken up to show you. Okay, so let me make sure I'm sharing this with sound. Okay, and okay, we're good. All right. So this is Reaper. If you're not familiar with Reaper, it is a program that if you're using it as an individual, it costs like $60 US to download. It is absolutely just as powerful, if not more, I would say, than Pro Tools for certain things. And I highly recommend that if you're just starting out, it's worth it to learn Reaper, because I learned Pro Tools after I learned Reaper, and it only took me about a month to translate the skills from one program to the other. What you're seeing here is at the top, you'll see, see if I can get this in a better position. Okay, at the top of the window, you will see these colored bands up on the top. And those are called regions in Reaper. And what that allowed me to do, the way that I used them was I used them to define where in the timeline we were building certain scenes. Because remember, if we go back to that webpage, there are these 5 very distinct environments that we're trying to build. So we're trying to build this memory of riding the bike, this memory of working with clay, this memory or this experience for me, like the combination of like red or the combination of yellow and blue, like that color combination is very exciting and potent for me, and like has a very strong like emotional effect on me. So we talk about that in this blue yellow sense memory. We have a memory about taste, about eating a carrot in the desert. We have a reflection on, for me, I'm very sensitive to the barometric pressure changes. So I describe how like my body and specifically my head feels during thunderstorms. And we have the kind of, I would say, the climax of the show, which is this moment where Jackson's sensory world and my sensory world join in this kind of reenactment of a phone call where things got really silent when we had that original phone call, and we realized that our individual phones were picking up the environments around us because our voices weren't being the thing that the microphone was centering anymore. So it turned out that I could actually hear like everything in Jackson's world, like the birds outside their window, the train going by, all of that I could hear like in perfect clarity when I normally couldn't if they were actually talking. And the same was on my side. They could hear the rain outside my window and all of that. And so we build this kind of this moment of shared space that I think is really beautiful there. And then we have this outro, which is basically a set of like instructions about how to like pay attention to your sensory world. So as you can see, like these are all, each one of them is a very built, it's like a fully built out session in and of itself. And it'd be very difficult to navigate that if I didn't have these regions that were color coded, right? That I can see, okay, this is the start and end of the phone scene. This is the start and end of the outro, you know, it gives me some clarity, and it's almost like moving between these like islands of sound. So I think what we'll do is I'm going to play you a little bit of tape. I'm going to play you, let's see, what do I want to do? I think the phone sequence is possibly, I'm going to play you a little bit from this. Let's do the thunderstorm sequence because it's small, but just so the purpose of this is just so you can see that we're not really doing a whole lot, but we're like technically, but we're achieving a lot with the kind of layering of sound that's happening. So I'm going to zoom in as much as I can. Here we are. Okay. So what you're seeing here is 2 tracks of narration, so mine and Jackson's. Then you're seeing Jackson's musical compositions, which are literally, so you're seeing this like stem mandolin. I think there's a couple other things. There's like, I think there's one where they like blow into a glass jar or something to produce a sound. There are these individual sounds that Jackson has run through some very basic effects. Basically, yeah, there's barely anything on any of this stuff. So this on the mandolin and on the jar. So on the jar, there's all there is a low pass filter and some reverb. On the mandolin, all there is some pitch changes and some reverb. Okay, so this is not complex musical compositional skill. This is putting a sound that you made in your bedroom into your audio session and messing around with it. So let's listen to that. All right.
I have a really deep.
Hold on, I'm having some audio issues. Let me close some things. Let me see, make sure that I don't have anything else open.
I have a.
This is not going well, actually. Sound is not working very well on this. So we're going to listen to it on the website, and I'll just show you it on screen. Okay. We're going to listen to it here, so that way you can hear it, but I'll keep the screen up. I think we can just hear the individual part. Yes. Amazing.
Moving through the air and kind of rumbling through your body when
absorb
many remarkable things.
Where there was so in when it's interaction in like the objects that surround me.
I didn't bring very much up.
Yeah.
And smell. It was and like I'm sure taste by objects that's ever existed in the universe.
Okay. Can everybody hear? Sarah, give me the heads up in the chat if you can hear. Okay. And can you see?
I have a really deep love-hate relationship with thunderstorms because I love the rain. I love the feeling of thunder moving through the air and kind of rumbling through your body when it gets close enough. However, the changes in air pressure that occur leading up to a thunderstorm are extremely, extremely uncomfortable for me. As the weather starts to change, as humidity starts to set in, as the sky becomes more overcast, it hasn't rained yet, but it's coming. My head tends to feel like it is filling with pressure, as if the contents inside of it are expanding out and like can't be contained in the bones of my skull, or like there's something inside of my head that is pressing up against like the nerves in my brain, and they're kind of like tingling and shaking, and like the space inside my head feels pressurized, like there's air pressing against the inner cavity of my skull. And sometimes this extends like down into like my sinuses and my nose, and even like the bones in my face feel like they're pressing out. And then when it rains, usually I feel better. Like as soon as the storm breaks, and as soon as like it's almost like there's like some coming back to like a sort of equilibrium. Yeah. And so I mean, as annoying as it is to like physically feel kind of unwell as the weather changes, there's also something really kind of incredible about being in such like intimate dialogue with the atmosphere.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Okay. So what's cool about that sequence to me is that we did a whole sequence about thunderstorms without using thunder or rain once. And the things that you heard were, one actual real instrument, which was mandolin, but it was kind of played in a really off kilter, not really like musically accurate way, right? It's just kind of chaotic strumming. You heard the glass jar, which you can hear here, that sound that signifies the wind or the atmosphere changing. You hear that kind of plunky, like drip droppy sound at the very end, which is that we've used instead of raindrops. And that is also a mandolin, and it's just a single note being plucked here, but it's been treated with a low pass filter, which is when you allow you pass over your lower frequencies, so you allow them to stay, but then you're extracting out your higher frequencies of a sound. And then a little bit of reverb, which just is it's a way of approximating the way that sounds, when they move in real space, might bounce off of surrounding surfaces or objects. But I just think that that's exciting, that you could really just use everyday objects in your world. Like, I'll go back to the slideshow for a second, if I can find it. All things that I have, that I pick up around my life because I need to. But that sound, right? Like, what could be done with that sound of the marbles in the glass bowl and in my hand? Or like, what would happen if I did that same action with the marbles in the glass bowl and the ceramic bowl and in my hand inside of this little concrete space here? Like, how they might bounce off of that space. That's something like either I'm doing in real life out in the world, like with my recorder and capturing that sound, or I'm just remembering these things in my mind and trying to capture that feeling, like even just the light and the color of the marbles and the reflection off the window, also that too, like, is coming into this process. Okay, so just a couple more things about Reaper before we move to Pro Tools. So let's see. One thing that I really love about Reaper that you, as far as I know, can't do in, like, I know you can't do it in Pro Tools, and it annoys me infinitely, is that you can open a new project tab. And what that does is, alongside your existing session, you open up a new session, and it can live right next to it, and you can see them both. And so if I bring audio into it, let's go here. If I bring audio into it, it will let me access anything. Okay, I'm bringing in truly random things right now. If I bring in audio, see, do I have any actual music here? That'd be great if I did. Okay, this is truly random, so I really don't know what it is even here. But if I bring in audio to it and I do something that I like, so say, oh wow, I really have made this amazing sound design sequence and I'm obsessed with it and it's amazing. I can literally copy and paste like you would in a Google document between sessions. Like I can copy and paste my tracks. Let's see, it'll let me see. You should be able to. Didn't grab everything, maybe. Yeah, there they are, right? So that sequence in its order, in its time, in its space in the timeline, everything is preserved. And I can just copy and paste from one section to another, from one session to another. And this is really important because often what I'll do before, when I'm building, especially a complex project like this, is I will have a session like this, which is my final project session. It's the thing that I will send off to whoever is my collaborator or to the engineer who's finalizing it or whoever needs to see it, and collaborate with me on it will get this copy. But then I will have two other sessions open in Reaper. One is called, will usually be called the library session. So I'll enable this library. And I'm going to save it where I meant to save things. Yeah, there we go. All right, I'm going to make sure that all of my media is copied. Or actually, let's do that. Copy, yeah, let's actually. Making sure it has its own little subfolder, and it'll go there and it'll live alongside my real session. And the library session basically is where I'd keep all the tape that I'm like maybe sort of considering using, and just I keep it in this place rather than, and it just helps me like visualize it and see it, and I can move things around, I can organize it, I can say like, oh, this is all my ambient tape, and I'm going to assign these all the same color because they're all ambient tape and all ambient tape is green. And so when I'm trying to build my project for real, I know that I'm going to go look inside my green ambient tape section and I'm going to pull what I need from here and copy and paste it directly rather than going through my file paths and all of this and trying to find the thing that I need. The other cool thing is that you can play audio from one session and another session at the same time, which also helps with deciding what to put in a complex session. All right, so we have this playing. We also have this playing. This is bad because for some reason the audio is behaving badly. So that's important in helping me make decisions quickly. I can just play things directly in my library alongside what's actually happening in my real project. The other thing that I will do is I'll have a library session and I will have one more session open. And this I will call my sketchbook session. And this I will save alongside the library session and alongside the final project session. And the sketchbook session is where I'll actually start to make moves. Like the library session, all the tape kind of stays, at the kind of start of the session. It's just for organizational purposes. The sketchbook is where I actually move things around, try different effects, like what would happen if I, were to, take all of if I were to amplify the lower frequencies on this pencil sound, and I want to test that in somewhere safe that isn't going to mess with like a really complex project that's already being built. I'll do it in the sketchbook, and if I like it, then I can just copy the track. I should be able to copy the track. Oh, actually, let's see if I do this, what happens. I think I might be able to. I might not be able to copy the track. It's been a while since I've worked in Reaper, but I can basically decide to treat this same piece of tape that way in my real session, right? Like I can say, oh, this worked, And so rather than you know, making a move in here where this is all so set up so carefully. I make all of my kind of experimental moves in here in the sketchbook. And then when I commit to something, I might copy and paste it in, or you know, find a way to build it into this full assembly in a way that's not disruptive. So that is what's important to me about Reaper. And I know that I'm just very conscious of time. I have no idea actually how we're doing on time. So Sarah, if you want to tell me in the chat how we're doing on time, because I know probably people are like, how do you use plugins? How do you adjust EQ? How do you do all the things? So I do want to make time for that. So I'm going to close off. Okay, great, amazing. We can go as long as I like. Okay, super duper. Yeah, so I'm going to, rather than show you plugins and things in Reaper, I'm going to show you in Pro Tools just because that's where I've been working mostly lately. And I have a more kind of muscle memory workflow built up and I can move a lot faster, but it's only because I've been forced to use Pro Tools. Really, my tool of choice is Reaper. And I think it makes sense for sound designers, especially for complex projects, because of these things that you can do as far as keeping your experiments and your tape organized in certain ways. All right, so what you should be seeing is the Pro Tools window. And this is from a project called Say You're Sorry, which was a client project for this company called Bucket of Eels, who was working for Audible. So I did have a lot of more oversight, right? Like I couldn't just kind of do everything that I wanted in a chaotic way. So I did have to kind of explain my choices a lot more. And I think that was a really good lesson in like how to continue being creative, even with some more official constraints on your work. And what I'm going to play for you is a scene from that project where in the story, so the stories are all about, you know, when public officials or celebrities feel compelled or are compelled by the public to give apologies for something that they have done or that has happened while they've been in power with their politicians. And, you know, is it possible for the public to receive that apology and like for it to actually mean something? Is true like reconciliation possible? And I think that was like an interesting question. And in this episode, we're talking about when the former US President Bill Clinton was attempting to apologize on behalf of the US government for conducting radiation experiments on unknowing population of basically patients in hospitals during a time that Bill Clinton himself did not preside over, but during his time as president, he was asked to atone for the fact that the US had done this. And so what you're hearing, you'll hear from an expert, like a legal expert on this event in history. You'll hear from our host also giving you some additional context. Then you'll hear from 4 people who are basically, this tape is coming from archival recordings of basically a testimony from family members of those who had been experimented on, who were basically sharing their stories with government and kind of imploring them to atone for this and to ask that these victims be honored and appropriately. So the challenge with this was I wanted to make sure that each one of these family members had their own distinct voice and we knew who they were and that we could identify them as separate from one another, but also that it was still clear that they were part of a collective group calling for collective action about a specific thing and that there was collective power in their stories together. So the way that I did that, what you'll see is this, you will see up here, the way that I don't even know how to get into this. Sometimes sessions are just so complex, but you'll see that I have all these folders that are organizing and keeping things kind of out of the way for you. All of my dialogue tape is in this folder called Voice, right? It's a lot of tracks, and I've collapsed it into a folder so that way I don't have to look at it. If it's all locked in, I usually just put it in a folder and hide it away so I can focus on looking at my sound, which is here. Music is in its own folder. There's one piece of music that's being used in two different ways here. So there's one piece of music that is being played straight, like with almost no effect on it. I think I've taken some of the highest frequencies out to kind of tone it down a bit. I've used EQ on it, but other than that, it's played pretty straight. And then I have manipulated this musical track so that certain things happen to it over time. So there are moments when a delay is affecting it, moments when reverb is affecting it, but not all at once. So let's see if I can show you that. Yeah, you'll see, okay. So the delay comes in kind of at the end, at the tail, to sort of basically extend the life of the music track a little bit longer, and to kind of make it a little bit more dense and chaotic toward the end. And the same is happening here with the reverb time, or actually, no, the reverb time is not, yeah, that's unnecessary, never mind. Reverb time is not necessary. That's just, sometimes things get left over in your process that you think you're gonna use and you don't. It's the real, but the important thing to note is how I've used what's down here. And down here are these sequences, these two little couplets, these pairs of what these are. These are single trumpet notes, which you'll hear, but each of the sequences is different. And they're given kind of used as little sonic IDs for each of these family members' voices. So before they come in, we hear this little trumpet announcement, basically, that gives them almost like an entrance into the story. And then at the very end, we hear all of their sequences, all of their trumpets, all of their voices at once. And that's kind of signifying their collective power as speakers on this tragedy. So I'm going to play this through, and again, but I did just want to, give you the lay of the land and show you what's going on. But again, if you look at my plugins here, there's barely anything happening. There's not a lot of effects on anything. And I think what I hope is clear to you is that it's more about, at least for me, my process, it's more about collage and layering and sequence and time, and kind of arriving at this mix of sounds that builds something greater than the sum of its parts, rather than how any individual one of these sounds is manipulated using the technology.
What we could do for people was listen to them tell their stories, right? And validate their experiences. We saw that responsibility as extremely important and almost sacred.
Something's not playing, I feel like. Something muted. Hold on, I'm gonna stop for a second because I feel like something's not playing correctly. Or it's like, I'm gonna just share, make sure my fidelity is on. Okay, you can hear it. It's just very faint.
Here's Al Marine testifying before Congress.
On July 18th, 1947, 3 doctors and a nurse entered Ward B at the University of California Hospital in San Francisco and injected plutonium into my father's left leg. 3 days later, the leg was amputated. His hospital chart states that the limb was sent to pathology and radiological study. Elmer Allen was my father.
And here's Jerry Musso, the nephew of radiation experiment victim HP6, whose real name was John Musso.
I am Jerry Musso from Rochester, New York. I'm here to tell you about John Musso, my uncle, who was one of the 18 people injected with plutonium by government scientists at 4 different locations throughout the country in the mid-1940s. The injections were given without knowledge or consent of the people involved.
Okay. I apologize if that was a bit faint or if there were things that were inaudible. I think there's also might be some dialogue tape missing. But I just think this is a very simple strategy, and I use it quite a lot, is taking these individual musical notes, which I usually find on Freesound or have other, like musician friends who have collections of them, people who practice scales, can easily record something like that for you on whatever instrument they use. But I think they're very helpful to have as these kind of little building blocks to often I use it to like augment a piece of music that I think is working in some ways, but it doesn't quite have everything I need, right? Like this music track here, I'll try see if I can play it solo and see if I can maybe get it to play at a higher volume. Let's see what's happening here. Oh yeah, it's super low. Okay. But this music track here is like pretty constant. Right, it's kind of just a hum or a drone almost.
Here's B at the university.
And what I needed was a sort of punctuation that the original track that I found didn't have. I needed something that could highlight these individual voices. So that's where these like individual music notes came in. And what you're hearing here also this moment is just this very, very subtle electrical hum as a kind of callback to the nature of the experiments, which were radiation-based experiments. So you can kind of embed these like little Easter eggs, I guess, or these little hints or things to elements that are in the story, but like you don't want to be too overt about, and they can kind of just live in the underbelly of your sound world. Okay, so the other thing that I was going to do is basically now leave time for Q&A, and what I have is a basically an open Pro Tools session that I can play around in if people want to see something specific or have specific technical questions, and or have any other questions, whether that's like career stuff or how to find sound or use sound, whatever. But basically Q&A is open, and I have an open Pro Tools session that's empty, and I can show things in there if people want. And I do see some questions in the chat that I'll just address now while people are maybe gathering their thoughts. So are these session windows equivalent to multi-track windows in Audition, except in Audition you can't have multiple multi-tracks open at once? Yes, they are equivalent to multi-track windows in Audition. But as far as I know, right, you can't have multiples open in Audition, which I think is a drawback. And then to Dominic, so yes, my process is to have the library where I keep all of my tape easily accessible and I can play it and sample it. And then I play around in the sketchbook, and then I will bring what I like into the main project, and that's the workflow in Reaper. And I find that that keeps my final project sessions much cleaner, especially if they're going to be really complex. And if there aren't questions, I skipped over a bunch of lecture stuff that we can go back to, but because I was afraid of running out of time. But I know that in the past I've taught this type of thing and I've spent too long on lecture and not enough time showing actual techniques and stuff in an audio software. So I think if people have questions. How do you give a client a budget on time for a project? That is an excellent question. It's really hard. And I think I've messed up quite a lot in my time as a sound professional. So essentially, I've been working in the audio field for close to, at this point, close to 5 years, not quite. And the first 2 years, I was barely doing money, like projects for money at all. I was pitching like one-offs, you know, and I was producing them all myself at a great deficit. Like I wasn't making much money at all on them. And then my first client project, I literally just took whatever rate they offered me because I was a young, desperate person. And I think that rate might have been, I think somewhere in like the 35 an hour range, which is like very low for sound design. I think I make exceptions, obviously, for people who are doing nonprofit work or work that has a specific like social cause that I feel passionately about, like I know that this person individually is working on a limited budget. I sometimes make exceptions for those types of projects. But if it's like a big client, I would never accept 35 an hour at this point. So my most recently, what clients have been offering me is around the like 55 to 60 an hour range, which I think is acceptable if it's a long-term project, and two, like you have like the long-term project, meaning you have a certain amount of stability, or you have other benefits, like say you're a part-time employee and you're actually getting, in the US at least, like health insurance, things like that. But if you are totally freelance and you're working and you've been in the game for a while, like 5 years plus, I think what I've heard is that like 80 people, people are, especially if you're doing both sound design and engineering, I've heard like 85 an hour, 100 an hour. I've heard numbers higher than that. So budget, I think for me often is like I hope that a client will come to me with a number that I can either accept or counter. And as for time, I know that my process takes a really long time. I know that like a 45-minute hour like episode of something will take me a week and a half at least to sound design. And that's if I can't work on the computer full days. So I don't work 8-hour days on the computer. I do like 3 or 4 hours a day, if that clarifies anything. So, but if you saw on my slides, like I had this pretty extensive process, right? Like I listen to things really deeply. I, make notes. I communicate really like a lot with the client. I'm doing a lot of trial and error, which in itself is more time consuming than if I had like, I just go to my preferred music library and pick a Blue Dot Sessions song and slap it in there, like, which is fine if I was just doing like a 2-way or something. But for the type of work that I get hired to do, like that's not possible. Like they're expecting me to build the world. Like that's why they hired me. So I would say an hour, like a week and a half working 4 hours a day per 45-minute episode is pretty normal to me. I prefer like either an hour, like, and I think an hourly rate will get you the most like fairly compensated for your time, but a project-based rate or a day rate might be easier for you to manage on the administrative end. I know for me, I would rather just know that there's like a budget cap on a project and that I can't work past X number of hours or whatever. And then I'm going to get paid in certain like large installments. Like that's easier for me to keep track of rather than tracking my time. So that's a long answer to that question. But Victoria's question, can Reaper open the same file type as Audition? So file type in terms of individual clips, like an MP3, a WAV, etc. Yes, but you cannot open a session from Audition in Reaper. And this is like the problem with digital audio workstations in general, is that in order to stay competitive, they make it impossible for you to open one session type in another. Like my dream would be that I could open, a Reaper file in Pro Tools, so that way I could send a session that I've like built in my preferred way in Reaper to an engineer who only uses Pro Tools. Like that's the problem, is that most engineers at the end of the pipeline are only using Pro Tools, and that's why all the rest of us, no matter where we are in the pipeline, are forced to use Pro Tools, even if that's not necessarily the best tool for what, like if you cut dialogue, you do not need to be doing that in Pro Tools. Like you can do that in Hindenburg or GarageBand, frankly, and be fine. So that is a problem. And there are workarounds. Like I know there is some person, I think in Australia, who wrote some kind of program that converts Reaper files into other types, or Reaper session files into other types of session files, but the program is only available on PC. So those of us who are working on Mac can't use that tool yet. So yeah, that's the answer to that question. I missed a little bit about the sketchbook. Was that a name for a session or a feature? So that is a name that I give to my sessions. And in Pro Tools, the way that I do it, also I'll show you. So in Reaper, I'm choosing to create 3 different sessions for every project: a library, a sketchbook, and a final project session. In Pro Tools, because I can't have multiple sessions open at once, what I've done instead is I'll create an experiments, a group of like quote unquote experiments tracks, and I will group them to a new folder, just a basic organizational folder, and call it experiments. And this way I can collapse the folder and mute it. So that way my actual session, my real working session, which is all of this stuff, stays clean, but I can still try things out down here if I want to. I can even, go so far as to make this inactive and invisible. So make an active, and that will make sure it's not playing, it's not doing anything, and it hides it. So that helps me keep organized in Pro Tools. Hannah, can you talk a little bit more about how you build scenes, come up with sound options, keep things from sounding crowded or overscored? Okay, so build scenes, come up with sound options, keep things from sounding crowded or overscored. I would say that the last part of your question, the keeping things from feeling crowded or overscored, is tricky because I think it's a lot about individual taste. I will say that my approach is pretty maximalist. Like, there's a show that I've just, finished working on, or I'm almost done working on, that is for a museum, and it's about art objects. And it's this really actually difficult problem of turning something visual into sound. And I was brought onto that project because they knew I was a maximalist, because they knew I would go all the way and I would build up many, many layers of sound, and I would, use sound that maybe wasn't even literally from the objects we were talking about. If we're doing an episode about paper, I might not even use sounds that come from paper, or sounds about concrete. Like I might not use, footsteps on a concrete floor. I might try something else. I might find some like percussion of, someone beating wood blocks against a couch or something, I think that, so as far as things feeling overcrowded or overscored, I think part of it is about knowing what your natural inclination is, and then also knowing what your client or wants from you if you're working on client work. If you know that you've heard like other projects they've done and they are more simple, you may, maybe go all out on your first draft, and then you get feedback to pull back, and you pull back. If you're making a project for yourself, I would say really just follow your instinct, and then play it for someone who maybe doesn't know anything about radio or sound. Like I think people who, if someone's saying, oh, I like really wanted to know what this story is about, but I really had trouble following it because about 3 minutes in, there was all this music and all this sound, and I like didn't really know what was going on, then you know that maybe you've overshot and you've done a bit too much. Basically, if your sound isn't helping audiences navigate the story, if you're working in a narrative form anyway, then your sound isn't serving you. If you have a completely other goal, which I often do, which I'm making work that really, the sound is sometimes more important than the verbal, written, spoken content, then that's a bit of a trickier question. And that is that I don't like saying this because it's not helpful, but I think that it's about honing a certain sensitivity to the outside world and like what like strikes you as interesting or pleasurable about like real world spaces, and kind of embedding that in your sound. And as far as how I build scenes, come up with sound options, I'm just going to go back to my slideshow actually and show you some things, because there are things I skipped over. And I think that'll help answer your question actually. So often when I am at the stage where I am looking for sound and I realize I've made my notes about the rough cut, I've identified where I think I need to build scenes or do something specific with sound, then the question is like, what tape do I get and how am I going to treat that tape? And it's been helpful for me to think about different kinds of tape as actually being equivalent to different kinds of physical materials. So I often think about dialogue tape as similar to like carpentry, where you need to cut really precisely, join really precisely. You don't want anyone to notice your joints really, they're serving a very structural function. I think about, music and ambient tape as something that's more like clay, that like does have its own like internal structure and qualities, but can really be manipulated and stretched and twisted and altered in many, many different ways and still maintain its like integrity. And then I think about archival tape as like found objects or found images, right? They're bringing along all this other context from where they came from, and that is then complicating and living up against everything else you already have in your story. And it's kind of transforming what's around it and being transformed by what it's sitting in. And that kind of like helps me think about, okay, like what does this story need? Does this story need more context, more specificity? Then I might actually go searching for archival tape about something specific, like with Feeling With, which was that story about sensory perception. All of the transitions between segments came from like, little like children's scientific informational videos about like, this is how the eye works, this is how the ears work. Like they were these kind of almost like very literal approaches to sensation, to kind of ground us before we, go into these very subjective experiences. But then for something like, but then for other parts of that program in Feeling With, like I was trying to build these like specific worlds, but that were almost always, memories, not things that were happening in the present. Like, how do I build a desert out of sound? How do I build a thunderstorm out of sound? And that was more of a clay question, a clay problem, right? Like I needed to find bass sounds, so the mandolin, the glass jar, that could then be twisted and manipulated to get them to do what I needed to do. How do you make a glass jar into the wind? You know, I think it's about seeing potential in sound. And when you go searching for sound in libraries, like I often will download a lot more than I end up using. And I will download things that have nothing to do with the literal topic that I'm like researching or making a story about, but that I think have potential to behave in ways that could align with what the goals I have are for the story. I hope that helps, Hannah. Some other things, these are like things I skipped over, but strategies that I use to help me not feel overcrowded. So I like this idea that comes from painting. When you're first learning to paint, you're often told only to use red, yellow, and blue, and maybe white or black, depending on your medium and your teaching principles. But it's basically a way of, one, keeping you from getting overly complicated with all these tertiary colors, these, already complicated violets and greens and oranges and, secondary and tertiary colors, and really gets you to just focus on the basics and expand what the basics can do. Like learning how to mix color is infinitely more valuable than going out and buying every single color that exists in the line of paint that you're buying, And I think that's the same with sound. So when I'm feeling really stressed out or feeling like I don't know how to approach a story, I'll often say, okay, well, what would happen if I was only allowed to use 3 pieces of music, period? I couldn't bring in any ambient tape. I can't bring any other music. I can't do anything except use these 3 pieces of music. Like, how can I make those 3 pieces of music behave like 30 pieces of tape? How can I change them to do what I need them to do and still remain like harmonious as they work together? And so I'll often transform the same bit of tape many, many, many different times throughout its usage in a story. So like you saw in that Pro Tools session I showed you, like that there was, those 2 tracks of music with the same piece, but they were treated very differently. Like one had delay and reverb on it and one did not. So it's taking like this original, what this image is showing, it's on the left is a collage from my sketchbook, which is then transformed into a linoleum block carved for the purpose of printmaking. The print is then pulled in a single color in an analog way, and then it's digitally recolored and made into a totally different artwork at the end. And I think that's the same with sound, right? Like I can take that original piece of tape and transform it 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 times until it becomes something else. And I might keep it at every stage. I might use it in a different place of the story at a different stage. I think about layering, that there are, you can layer sounds with the intention to create something that is accurate, right? So you're trying to create a specific space, a specific geographical place, a specific moment in time. You want everything to feel aligned and real. Or you can layer with the intention to create something that is beyond the real, or that does something that reality can't do. And basically extend the world that your story lives in, beyond the kind of confines of what you might be able to record out in the field. So what you're seeing here on the left is the kind of beginnings of a multi-layered silkscreen print. So you're seeing one layer of details, which are these fine drawings of like bricks and pipes and windows and wooden textures. And then you're seeing the layers of flat color, which go underneath those details, that show light and shadow and differences in material. And then you're seeing the print where all of those layers are assembled in the correct order. And this looks like a relatively realistic depiction of the side of a building. And then on the far right here, you're seeing a chaos, remix layering, where I have all the same parts, but they've been reconfigured in a totally different way. And then the other thing, I think, again, to the question of being crowded or overscored, I think thinking about negative space, like thinking about there's a professor I had in undergraduate, like my undergraduate like 3D design class, which at the time was called spatial dynamics, who would say that negative space is positive form. So if you think about space as actually taking up space, right? Like it's doing something active rather than, oh, I have dead air, I have silence, that's bad. Like I think especially if we come from news, we're taught to cut our tape really tight and not to allow for space. And I think that's why stories can sound really overcrowded. It actually has less to do with the sound and more to do with the way dialogue is cut. So I would say sometimes if you're feeling like your story is like getting claustrophobic or feels overcrowded, it might help for you to space out the dialogue more and give your speakers more time between each other or between their own words and allow sound to fill that space or not. Yeah. Other questions? I'm just holding on in case anyone has any additional questions. But if not, Sarah, let me know what's the best thing to do, if things are piling up in the chat on your end or not. But oh yeah, Hannah, I'm glad that those analogies were helpful. I do find them very helpful, and it's great. Okay, well, it seems like you all are probably tired of having information thrown at you. Oh, here's okay, in Reaper, what's the column on the right with the elements? Let me see, I'm not quite sure what you're referring to, but I'm gonna open it real quick. I mean, honestly, I will just say in general, like, I don't think that you need to know what every single thing is in these programs to start using them. But so, Rich, I'm not sure, I have Pro Tools open now. I'm gonna just screen share for a moment. Okay, this question with the effects is a very long question, Hannah, and I'm gonna try and get to it, but it's, and I know that people really want that information, but it's just, I'll do my best, but I'll explain why I think this is a complicated question. Okay, Rich, are you talking about on the far right, the gray column? The gray column, at least on my right in Reaper, the gray column is full of my files. Like it's basically a mirror of like my file explorer or my finder on my computer. On the far left is my list of tracks. And each of the tracks have a little like course adjustment volume knob, and then this little folder that shows you what effects are being used on each individual track. Was that the question you had? Up top here on the left are basically the Reaper lets you kind of customize which tools you want up, like kind of at easy reach for yourself in your setup. And so this is just that up here. The white column, yes, the white column is the Media Explorer, Rich. Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing with Reaper is like you can kind of put this wherever you want. Like I can, I can set my window up very differently. Like I could have my Media Explorer down below or put my mixing, I could choose not to have my mixer up at all. So some people might have this in a totally different place than me if you've seen other people work in Reaper. Okay, Hannah, I'm gonna just show you a few things in Pro Tools because it's easier for me to show you. But I will just say that I think I don't know how we're going to solve this as a industry, but I think that there's this real thing where like plugins and software feel really mysterious to people, and like it's why people don't like start doing sound design or don't feel like they can call themselves sound designers, and they feel like you have to know, like you've had to read like Pro Tools manual and become perfect engineer in order to do this, and you just don't. Like you really like like again, Pro Tools, I barely know it. Like I learned it to take a job, you know, like a job required I use Pro Tools, so I learned Pro Tools in a month to do it. And I think like, so you might, you know, I highly encourage you to go take another class with someone who is like, who has like a really deep knowledge of the technical stuff, because what I'm showing you is like my duct tape and bubble gum paperclip put together way of doing things. And I would say that effects don't necessarily have like direct analogs, like where it's not like, oh, if I pitch something this way, then it means that this will happen emotionally. But I think that it's hard because it's like, it's, you know, it has so much to do with like what's happening in the narratives part of the story. I'll just bring in I'll bring in some audio and just do a quick example. And then I think that'll be the last thing I'll do, just so you guys can come away with actually having seen me do something technical and you feel like you've gotten that fix. Let's see, okay, so we have, trying to find a piece of like actual music that's not weird musical notes. Okay, this is good because it's all of them. All right. Okay, so in Pro Tools, audio gets loaded into what's called a clips list, which is like a file explorer, but more annoying because you can't organize anything in any recognizable order. You can sort of like place parameters and like find things by searching, but you can't like rearrange things and organize them in any way that makes any sense. So I'm just going to drag in my narration. It'll let me. Why is this? Might be that this is the other thing about Pro Tools is it really doesn't like you to put things that are mono into stereo tracks or vice versa. So I just had to change a track from mono to stereo. This is, again, I'm going to just be complaining about Pro Tools all day because I hate it. But I think it's useful for you to know. So, and then I'm just dragging in a piece of, like a full piece of music. And then I'm also going to drag in a stem. So I'm going to drag in the melody and I'm going to drag in the instruments. I'm going to relabel this. And I'm going to label this melody stem. And then I'm going to drag in a piece of ambient tape. So I believe this should be like insects humming or something. Okay. So what I have here are two pieces, one piece of narration, one piece of music, and two stems, which are basically the individual components of a musical track pulled out. Am I screen sharing? No, I'm not. Let me share. All right. All right, so what you should be able to see is my first track, which is narration, a track of music and 2 stems. So, and then a piece of ambient tape here. So one thing that I often do with dialogue is I think the voice is like an underutilized space of play. And you can't always do this, like especially if you're working on something that's more like hard journalism, hard news, it doesn't make sense to manipulate someone's voice. But if I'm working on like an experimental type feature story or a documentary or a fiction piece, something weird, I'll often create a duplicate of the voice, and I will, manipulate that to do something specific in terms of mood. So I'm just going to make a duplicate of my narration here. So if I play this straight.
So gentle, and the light so soft.
Right. That's, that has its own emotional tenor to it, and that's cool. But what would happen if I were to, this is my duplicate narration, if I were to change the pitch, I'm actually going to go a full octave deeper, and then I'm really just making random choices here, but I'll do a little bit of a delay on it. And I'm literally just choosing a preset at random, and this is often what my process is. I do not know what every one of these does, and I'll just try it out. And I'll play both at once. I'll just play this, I'll solo this, and so you can hear it. So that gets us into kind of creepy ghost territory that I don't particularly like. So actually I decide, okay, I don't like this, so I'm going to take this pitch off, and I'm going to try and actually change the quality of the sound more with EQ. So I kind of want to sound like far away and distant, like I've been like on an intercom or a phone or something. So I'm going to boost some of these high frequencies here and take out some of the more natural frequencies of my voice and see what that does.
What a glorious sky.
Right? That's great. I love that. Okay. So then if we play both of these together, what I might do is I'll keep the altered one at normal volume, but just take my original audio down a bit. So it's still there, like my real natural untouched voice is still there to kind of guide us as we're hearing this more distorted voice.
What a glorious sky, and the moon so gentle, and the light so soft.
And what I like about that is it does make me feel like I'm speaking to you from far away, or like from some kind of alternate dimension portal. Maybe I am with the moon, and again, totally subjective, right? Like all of you might be having different reactions to that. All right, so let's see what's going on with our music here. I'm gonna just I'm gonna keep on the main track of music for a second. All right.
What a glorious sky, and the sky so gentle, and the light so soft.
Okay, so let's do that one more time.
What a glorious sky, and the sky so gentle, and the light so soft.
So I already know this is too much going on. For one, it's way too loud. So first of all, my first line of, if I still wanted to try and keep the full track, I would definitely lower it. But even then, like there's things about this full track that I don't particularly like. So before I abandon it entirely, I'm going to try a couple of things to see if I can salvage it without moving instead to the stems. So one thing I might do is, again, I go to EQ, and I might, in this case, take some of the high notes out and get us to a point where we're only hearing the kind of lower, more stable kind of not parts of the song, and not those punchy like piano bits that are kind of like plink plonking around and interrupting my voice. So let's see if that does anything. I'm bringing all these down a little bit, or a lot.
What a glorious sky, and the moon, so gentle, and the light, so soft.
But there's still like, there's percussive elements that I find to be a little bit interrupting. There's things about it I still don't quite like. Let's try what happens when I pitch this down a little bit, or a lot.
And the moon, so gentle, and the light, what a glorious sky, and the moon, so gentle, and the light, so soft.
That's actually much better, pitched down. And so then one other line of defense I might do is I'm like, well, it's still too recognizable. It still sounds like YouTuber influencer music I got out of a sound library, which this is. So then I might go up here to my audio suite, go to other, and I might reverse it.
What a glorious sky, and the moon, so gentle, and the light, so soft.
Okay. The last thing I might do on this is a tiny bit of reverb, just at the very end there. And the way I would do this is basically I'm selecting a property that can be manipulated in time, so on the timeline. And that's, I'm basically choosing just the mix, which is like how much the effect applies to the audio or not. And then I'm going to go into my little reverb choices here. That should give me, I should be able to see the automation line. And I'll make it so that way this is only going to come into effect very late in the playing of this track.
What a glorious sky, and the moon, so gentle, and the light, so soft.
Right, and then you have that nice little reverb tail that you so often hear in radio stories. Okay, so I think I've salvaged the full piece of music, so I'm going to keep it. Then I think I'll save the stems for a little bit, and then I feel like I want some ambient. I want something that feels real, that feels like from the environment. So I have this insect sound here, this cicada sound, and these birds and all.
What a glorious sky, and the moon, so gentle, and the light, so soft.
Okay, so I quite like that actually, how it kind of starts pretty quiet, and then as we get to the end of my little dialogue note here, the space starts to fill up with more sound. So there's not a whole lot that I feel like I need to do here. One thing I might do is just, again, I'm using my EQ just to
what a glorious sky.
I might take out some of the highest highs here,
so gentle, and the light,
to make it a little clearer and not as abrasive. But it's not a huge, I'm not making a huge shift here. I might fade it out. Okay. The other thing I might do, so these are my musical stems here. And these are basically little components of the song we just used. And I like using stems because they give you a way to like build a harmonious palette of sounds without it all having to kind of be compressed in the space of one track. So this is just the melody. There's that piano. And then this is just the kind of other background instrumentation. And it's good to kind of poke around elsewhere.
28.
Elsewhere. And see if there are parts of the song that you like better. Like I didn't even notice that there's horns. You hear that? I'm gonna make a cut and take that bit because I like it. I don't think I'm gonna use the piano, so I'm cutting that out. All right, so I have these horns now that I'm really into. And I think I might want to have those start to come in quite late in the sequence here. And kind of once they kind of add this sense of like momentum after my voice ends. And I'm going to bring them down because they're quite loud. All right, so let's play it all together.
What a glorious sky, and the moon, so gentle, and the light, so soft.
I really like those horns, and I think they're sitting somewhere in the middle, probably. Yeah, and I can boost them now. I can take some of the highs out here. And so now it's mostly horn.
What a glorious sky, and the moon, so gentle, and the light, so soft.
So really like that is really what's going on. Like it's very it is extremely trial and error, and extremely like I'm really just making decisions on the fly, and I'm just listening to see how things make me feel. But Hannah, was that a good intro, I guess, to that question, to answering that question? I feel like it's so deep, and I think the real answer is like you just have to get in there and get your hands messy. So if there are no questions left, I think that's going to be my outro. Hannah, I'm glad that was helpful. But yeah, my big encouragement to you all is to really just don't think of sound design or your audio software as intimidating. It's just like any other creative tool. Like it really is processes of trial and error that are going to get you to the point where you feel comfortable using it. I think what's more important is that you focus on like developing your creative voice, and that means like listening to the world and figuring out like what calls your attention, what brings you joy, what makes you curious, what are the things that you want to kind of store in your mind and your body to bring back into your work. Like that's what matters. And I think truly like that's what will make like your work as a sound designer better. And you can get better at these tools in a technical sense. But that's like learning anything else, like learning how to maintain your bicycle or whatever, it's just learning what the buttons do. But the hard work is learning like what's the work that you want to make and what do you want to hear in the world. So, yep.